Well, hello there, and welcome to the National Wilderness Skills Institute Laboratory, where we've been working all week hard to distill the individual elements that comprise wilderness stewardship performance. My name is Dusty Vaughn. I'm the National Wilderness and Wild Scenic Rivers Specialist for the USDA Forest Service out of the Washington office in DC. I'm joined by my lab partner, Eric Sandeno.
Thanks, Dusty. My name is Eric Sandeno, and I'm the National Wilderness and Wild Scenic Rivers Information Manager for the USDA Forest Service for the Washington office, though I'm based in a remote secret lab in the West Virginia mountains. Today, we're going to walk you through our latest scientific breakthrough, the measuring of wilderness stewardship performance, or WSP. WSP is the performance measure for wilderness within the USDA Forest Service. But first, a quick housekeeping items. So you joined this session on mute. You can use the chat box to add questions, and we will get to them at the end of today's session. You can also raise your hand function at the end of the session as well, and we will call on you. If you've been participating in any of the WSP sessions during the week, I encourage people to use the chat box for questions only. Since this is our last day together and wilderness is about being untrammeled, and thus unrestrained, I'm going to take those restraints off of you for this session today, and you can talk amongst yourself in the chat box while our session is going on. I want to thank Jacob Wall and the Society for Wilderness Stewardship for serving as the Zoom host in our session today, and all the help he has provided during this week. The first thing we're going to do is get an idea of the awareness of WSP, or Wilderness Stewardship Performance. So Jacob, can you post the first 3 poll questions? All right, so we have 3 poll questions up just to get your general level of experience with wilderness stewardship performance, who you represent, as well as your favorite measuring device. See if we can get it close to about 30 people. See, the responses are coming in pretty good now. Just a few more. Okay, let's call that good. So Jacob, can you show the results? Okay, all right, so we have some basic awareness, but no practical application is the highest number as far as awareness. Majority of the people are Forest Service and Flask. Beaker is now 0 for 2. He's very disappointed as far as the favorite measuring device. All right, thanks, Jacob.
So there are 2 efforts within the Wilderness program, and you may have participated in sessions this week related to both of them: Wilderness Stewardship Performance, which we will talk about in this session, and Wilderness Character Monitoring. These 2 efforts work together but have some differences. Primarily, Wilderness Stewardship Performance tracks annual management actions and specific elements and feeds the results to Wilderness Character Monitoring. Wilderness Character Monitoring looks at the outcomes from Wilderness Stewardship Performance for each wilderness area every 5 years, and asks if wilderness character is improving, degrading, or stable.
So let me give you a couple examples. So first off, let's look at the invasive species element within wilderness stewardship performance. So within the performance measure, there are tasks associated with on-the-ground work to address invasive species, such as developing a monitoring plan, conducting surveys, treating the invasive species, and determine if the treatment efforts were effective. Whereas with wilderness character monitoring, every 5 years, you just look at the number of acres of invasive species that you and have those acres increased, decreased, or stayed the same in the last 5 years. A second example, but very similar, is recreation sites. In wilderness stewardship performance, you develop a recreation site monitoring plan, conduct monitoring, record your results, and take management action as needed. In wilderness character monitoring, on the other hand, you just look at the number and condition of sites every 5 years, and again, determine if conditions are improving, staying the same, or getting worse. If you want to learn more about wilderness character monitoring, there is an introduction session to wilderness character monitoring following this session, and you can always watch any of the recorded sessions from this week.
So let's focus on wilderness stewardship performance. As we said, it's a performance measure. The various resource areas within the Forest Service, such as wildlife, fire, timber, all have performance measures. These measures are how the individual forests and program areas report to Congress what is getting completed with the funds that they provide.
A famous management consultant whose writings contributed to the philosophical and practical foundations of modern business said, "What gets measured gets managed." That's what wilderness stewardship performance is about, measuring so we can identify how to manage. Wilderness has actually had a performance measure in place since 2001. And as Dr. Troy Hall mentioned in her presentation Wednesday, the performance measure came about from the requirements in the Government Results and Performance Act of 1993. This performance measure that was in place in 2001 was updated in 2015 to address some of the limitations that were identified over time with the performance measure itself. The updated performance measure was rolled out with the name Wilderness Stewardship Performance, or WSP. And when compared to the earlier version, Wilderness Stewardship Performance provides greater flexibility in selection of elements, addresses limitations with identified and certain elements, and makes a linkage to wilderness character monitoring much more explicit.
The performance measure is a way to identify, track, and score various management actions which occur in wilderness. Our focus is the actions. The primary purpose of the scoring is to have a nationally consistent method of determining progress of wilderness stewardship to preserve wilderness character as mandated by the Wilderness Act of 1964.
So we're going to get into how it works. The performance measure was developed using the 5 qualities of wilderness character, which I'm sure you've heard several times this week, and are outlined in the Wilderness Act as its foundation. Those qualities are natural, undeveloped, untrammeled, outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation, and other features of value. 2 additional categories were developed to address any special provisions which may appear in the enabling legislation for a wilderness, as well as critical work related to the administration of wilderness.
Within each of these qualities, one or more elements have been distilled and identified that address the work wilderness managers have been doing for decades. The elements also include work we do with other program areas to manage wilderness as a functioning system, including air, plants, fire, etc. Overall, there are 20 elements in the wilderness stewardship performance chemical makeup found in 6 wilderness quality solutions.
Each wilderness is required to select 10 elements from the total list of 20 possible elements to track and report progress on annually. To make sure all qualities were measured, wilderness areas were provided some sideboards on what they had to select. 4 elements are required for every wilderness. So that leaves a total of 6 elements at the discretion of each wilderness. The intent of element selection is to pick the elements that address local management priorities or address issues that need to be resolved. So in other words, pick elements that are relevant and help fix issues, not elements that just make you look good. Remember, no cheating on lab pop quizzes.
The other important thing to emphasize is the interdisciplinary aspect of the performance measure: water, air, plants, for example. These elements were not developed by subject matter experts. These elements were developed by subject matter experts from those program areas. Wilderness stewardship performance is about how wilderness stewardship performance is not about how wilderness managers see other program areas fitting into wilderness, but it is about the expectations of those interdisciplinary programs and how their expected program delivery works in wilderness. The elements were not developed in a vacuum.
Two additional reporting checkboxes were also added as part of this performance measure: the boundary maps and legal descriptions that are completed and transmitted to Congress as required by the Wilderness Act of 1964, and annual end-of-year reporting is completed on time. So let's go over the flow of each element and how they are scored. Even though 20 elements were developed by 20 separate subject matter experts, we work closely with each of the subject matter experts to provide a level of consistency across all elements. This helps make it easier for a wilderness manager to understand the expectations for each of the elements without necessarily memorizing all the steps. Secondly, it helped ground the subject matter experts during development so that one did not require too much at a level and someone else too little. Every element has 5 deliverables, and each deliverable has an assigned value of 2 points. There are some basic slight differences on how the elements are scored, but the goal was that the elements follow a basic flow in which you must go in order of the deliverables, and because they build upon each other.
That's right. So at the first level, the 2-point level, there's typically an informal survey. The 4-point level is a detailed survey. The 6-point level, we'll see a management plan. At the 8-point level, those management plan actions are being implemented. And at 10, monitoring of those management actions are being measured. Here's an example from the invasive species element. So as you can see at the 2-point level, there is an informal survey used to determine the presence, extent, abundance of all invasive species. Any early detection and rapid response actions are taken and data entered into a database. At the 4-point level, a more detailed quantitative survey has been conducted to determine, again, abundance and distributions. This time, populations have been mapped and data, again, entered into the database. At the 6-point level, an integrative management plan is being developed, consistent with policy, that identifies priority invasive species to be managed in the wilderness. At the 8-point level, management actions are implemented according to the priorities outlined in the management plan in the areas or populations posing the highest risk, right? And at the 10-point level, the management actions identified in the plan have been monitored and evaluated for their effectiveness, and their effectiveness is reported in the database. So there are actually 2 types of scoring in wilderness stewardship performance. So far, we've been talking about the incremental scoring, right? In the 2-point levels, which requires you to complete the requirements at each lower level before you can claim points at the next higher level. For example, if the 2-point level requires the development of a plan and the 4-point level calls for the implementation of actions in the field, you cannot get past the 2-point level until the plan is finalized. By contrast, accomplishment on the 2-point checkboxes can be claimed irrespective of other progress on that element. For example, the assigning of wilderness resource advisors to fires or conducting coordination meetings with state and other federal agencies can occur at any point and in any order. Finally, all elements are mixed together to give us an overall volume or total score of management actions. Each element score is added together. Wilderness areas reaching a total of 60 points are considered managed to standard. Displayed here is the national mean score for the 448 wilderness areas managed by the Forest Service since inception of the current program in 2015 through this past fiscal year 2020. Overall, we are seeing an upward trend in the mean score since the establishment of this program. However, unlike taking exams in organic chemistry, WSP is not about points or score. It is about completing management actions to preserve wilderness character. Do not get caught up in the numbers, or just like I did in chemistry, you'll end up in all kinds of trouble. Get it? All kinds? The carbon compound with 1 carbon to carbon triple bond? Okay, sorry with the bad chemistry jokes. All the good ones are gone. Oh, it took you a while on that one.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the elements. And for those of you who have not made the connection to our lab theme here today, we are now going to distill each quality of category, quality and category of wilderness character down to their separate elements. So first, we're going to take a look at the natural quality. There are 6 elements within this quality: invasive species, air quality values, natural role of fire, water, fish and wildlife, and plants. Invasive species. So this element is to track if invasive species have been identified, mapped, a plan has been developed to address the invasive species, actions are taken to address the issue, and actions are monitored for effectiveness. Those are basically the steps associated with this element. This element can track plants or animals. Most units are tracking plants, but in some situations, an invasive species can be an animal, such as in Florida. One of the most concerning invasive species there is the Burmese python. So animals can come into play as well as an invasive species. For more information about this element, it will be included in the round robin session this afternoon, and actually in about 45 minutes. And somewhat related to invasive species, Dusty, did you hear Beaker had to quit his job at the centipede laboratory?
No, I didn't.
He couldn't make ends meet.
Thanks, Eric. Jacob, can you post the pop quiz question related to air quality values? I'll continue on while folks answer this poll. Components of this element include an air quality plan has been developed, which includes the sensitive receptors important to this wilderness. You've identified what thresholds are for each sensitive receptor. You monitor the sensitive receptors, analyze the monitoring data for trends, and determine if wilderness is being detected. And remember, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the precipitate. All right, sorry, we may be scrapping the bottom of the joke beaker during today's call. That was another precipitate joke.
All right, let's see how people are doing. We have about 9 people have responded for. All right, here we go. There's a jump in numbers. Let's again see if we can get closer to about at least 30 before we shut down the poll. It's a tight race. All right, just a few more seconds and we'll shut her down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's call that good enough. All right, so the answer that most people responded is 1977, and that is correct. That is actually an amendment to the Clean Air Act itself that was passed, I think, in early 1977, and it stated that all wilderness areas greater than 5,000 acres and all national parks greater than 6,000 acres were Class 1 airsheds. And the interesting fact associated with this is if a wilderness gets expanded, and I'm going to use wilderness near me as an example, Dolly Sod's Wilderness was designated prior to 1977. It became a Class 1 airshed. It was expanded in 2009. That expansion also became part of the Class 1 airshed.
Now for natural wall of fire. Components of this element include making sure forest level plans have direction on what to do about fire in wilderness. The response to a fire follows that plan direction. A wilderness technical specialist is assigned to the fire, and a post-fire season evaluation occurs. To learn more, check out the recording on Wilderness Stewardship Performance, Natural Wall of Fire session that was recorded on Tuesday, once it is posted to the National Wilderness Skills Institute website.
All right, the steps with the water element. With water, sampling is conducted to determine if water quality and actions are taken to restore natural conditions and processes if those actions are monitored for effectiveness. So basically, what's the condition of your water? What do you need to do to address the conditions, and then monitoring those conditions for effectiveness? So just so you know, there's actually going to be a 30-minute training webinar on June 9th at noon Eastern time. Before our session ends today, I'm going to post the link to that training session.
Hey, Eric, you know how I consider myself to be an optimist, and I always see the cup or the beaker half full rather than half empty?
I do.
Yeah. Well, as scientists working for the National Wilderness Skills Institute Laboratory, we need to start seeing the glass as completely full. Half full with liquid and a half full with air.
That's true.
Okay, moving on. So now for fish and wildlife. Components of this element include a fish and wildlife strategy that has been established, management actions to conserve or recover priority species have been implemented, and those actions are monitored for effectiveness.
And with the plants element, what we're looking at is determining if there's been a rare plant strategy that has been developed, management actions to conserve the plant species has occurred, management actions have been monitored for effectiveness. And you're probably starting to see a theme here: plan, action, review for effectiveness. Hey, Dusty, speaking of recent illnesses, did I tell you about Beaker's recent illness?
No, you didn't. Is he okay?
Oh, he's doing okay now, but it took us a long time to figure out what it was. He would come into the lab every morning, make some toast, and then he'd feel terrible for a short period of time.
Oh
After a
no.
few doctor visits, we found out he's lab toast intolerant.
Thanks, Eric.
Sure,
All
Dusty.
right. Next, the undeveloped quality. The first element is recreation sites. Components of this element include recreation site monitoring plan developed, recreation sites have been located and monitored, direction exists in forest level plans related to the level of impact allowed, and actions are taken on sites when impact exceeds the current condition. To learn more, check out the recording of the Wilderness Stewardship Performance recreation site session from Tuesday once it's posted on the National Wilderness Skills Institute website.
The next element is the trails element, and it focuses on both system trails as well as user-created trails. For system trails, what this element is looking at is if the trail adheres to the trail management objective, and if not, have management actions taken place to address that. For user-created trails, it's pretty much just two steps. Conduct surveys to find those user-created trails, and then make a plan about what to do with them. I hope you had a chance to participate in Brenda and Matt's discussion on this element on Wednesday. If not, look for the recording when it's posted.
Next up is non-compliant infrastructure. So Section 4C of the Wilderness Act states that there shall be no structures or installations in wilderness. However, sometimes an area will get designated which does have structures and installations. In a few cases, the enabling legislation will address this and identify the structures and installations as a special provision, but many times it will not. This element focuses on the non-recreational physical developments, such as radio repeaters, administrative buildings, roads, and utility infrastructure, just to name a few, which were not identified in the enabling legislation. If they are identified as a special provision, then they will be addressed in other elements, which we'll be mentioning soon. Components of this element include an inventory of infrastructure has been completed, identify the elements from that inventory which are not compliant with wilderness, evaluate types of actions needed to address the non-compliant infrastructure, and appropriate actions have occurred.
Next is the motorized equipment and mechanical transport use authorizations element. Section 4C of the Wilderness Act does allow the use of motorized equipment and mechanical transport under certain circumstances. This element is all about making sure the proper steps are followed to review and approve the use of motorized equipment and mechanical transport when such use is warranted. This will also be one of the 4 elements discussed as part of our round robin session this afternoon, which is immediately following this session. So now we're going to look at the untrammeled quality, which is just one element, agency management actions. And this element is required for all 448 wilderness areas. Section 2C of the Wilderness Act defines wilderness as a place where natural conditions are preserved and where Earth and its community of life are untrammeled. I encourage you to learn more about the agency management actions element by reviewing the recorded session when they are posted from the session we had this last Thursday. Jacob, can you post the next questions about trammeling actions? All right, he's already on top of that one. So I'll continue while you answer. So wilderness is about not taking action just for the sake of taking action. With wilderness, our philosophy is geared toward restraint, which is not necessarily management in the way that most people think of management. The author of the Wilderness Act noted that when it comes to wilderness, we are guardians, not gardeners. You will find this concept a challenge for a lot of land managers because most of us didn't go to school or go to training to do nothing. Convincing people that not doing something is okay can be very difficult. This element is all about determining if, as managers, we properly gave a proposed action full consideration, looked at all the options, analyzed options that did not require prohibited uses, such as motorized equipment or mechanical transport, and that trends in decision-making are reviewed. So let's see how you did on the pop quiz. Okay, you guys are obviously doing really well this week. We'll end this now, it looks like. Post the question. So even though stocking lakes in fish came out on top, there were actually 2 correct answers, and by far the majority of the group was getting those answers correct. Using pesticides to eradicate an invasive species and stocking fish are actions. They are administrative authorizations that are modifying the wilderness itself. While global climate change, it is modifying things. It's not an authorization that the Forest Service is making. Trust me, land managers don't want to see global climate change occurring either. So thus they're not authorizing it. It's just, it is occurring. As well as conducting campsite monitoring. It is an action, but it is not invasive. It is not a trammeling as far as impacting the biophysical environment itself. Again, like I said, this was presented on Thursday, and there's also going to be another session also on this on June 9th as well, a 30-minute webinar, and that one's going to be at 11 o'clock Eastern time. As with the water element, I will post the information on that webinar in the chat at the end.
Thanks, Eric. Now for the outstanding opportunities quality. This one is broken into 2 elements, solitude and then primitive and unconfined recreation. Components of the solitude element include developing a plan, conducting solitude monitoring to determine if use levels are acceptable, taking action to protect solitude levels if they are above plan standards. Once it is posted on the National Wilderness Skills Institute website, be sure to check out the solitude monitoring and wilderness stewardship performance opportunities for solitude sessions if you missed them this week, presented by Dr. Troy Hall. She's also has an outstanding write-up in the International Journal of Wilderness in 2019 on this topic.
So earlier in this session, we talked about non-recreation related structures and installations. The primitive and unconfined recreation element is all about the recreation facilities or items provided for visitor convenience, such as metal fire rings, hitching poles, bear boxes, and those types of things. As the Wilderness Act states, these types of structures or installations may be provided if determined to be the minimum necessary for the administration of the area as wilderness. This element also focuses on the rules and regulations which restrict user freedoms. The steps in this element include inventory existing facilities, make sure forest plan direction is in place, which provides information on the types of facilities which are allowed or restrictions that are needed. And also it looks at making sure that any new actions are implemented as needed and that facilities and regulations are evaluated on a regular basis to make sure they're doing what was intended.
Now for other features of value. If you don't have any, you don't have to select this element, but it is typically focused on cultural resources. Components of this element include cultural resources plans have been developed, surveys for cultural resources have occurred, an evaluation of the surveys to determine which sites are integral to the character of the wilderness have been conducted, monitoring of the site occurs, and actions are taken where sites are being degraded. Again, to learn more, participate in the round robin session starting at the top of the next hour.
So next we're going to talk about special provisions. So the special provisions category actually comes from section 4D of the Wilderness Act, where special provisions are identified. If you don't have any special provisions, you don't have to select any of these elements. But if you do have a special provision, you're encouraged to select the appropriate elements. Livestock grazing and outfitter guide authorizations may be authorized, and those uses are likely identified in your forest plan. Other special provisions will be found in the enabling legislation. Specific to livestock grazing, where grazing occurred prior to designation, it's permitted to continue. So if you do have livestock grazing, the intent of this element is that monitoring of grazing is occurring and corrective actions are taking place if needed.
For the outfitter and guides element, components of this element include the outfitter and guides are implementing wilderness practices. They're providing programs to clients about wilderness. The permits and operating plans are in place, and corrective action is taken if they are not in line with the permit.
And then one of my favorites, the good old other category. This element is pretty wide open because it's about the special provisions for your specific wilderness. Congress decides what can be added to a wilderness and identifies those as special provisions. And like I said, they can be pretty open-ended. Airstrips, dams, roads, motorboat use, shelters, you name it. Those are all items that can be special provisions. And because the large open-endedness related to special provisions, we left this pretty open to allow it to fit your need. So overall, this element requires a management plan for the specific provision, monitoring to determine if the provision is in line with the plan, and corrective action is taken as necessary.
Hey, Eric, this element reminds me, why can you never trust atoms?
Why not, Dusty?
Because they literally make up everything.
That's good.
All right, next, administration. These are 3 mandatory elements. When wilderness stewardship was...
All right, looks like Dusty froze up.
Performance of wilderness.
There we go.
Stewardship performance. All right, am I back?
You're back. Congratulations. Welcome.
Okay. All right, so let me repeat that. The administration quality are basically there's 3 mandatory elements. When wilderness stewardship performance was developed, several surveys were provided to managers in the years leading up to the development and release of the wilderness stewardship performance. These 3 items came up over and over as something all wilderness areas needed to address. That is why they were identified as required. So this first one, workforce capacity. Components of this element include, are employees trained in wilderness knowledge, the appropriate wilderness traditional skills, have line officers been properly trained, and does the wilderness have enough staffing or volunteers to do their job?
So the education element, this one is pretty straightforward, and it's really about, is there an education in place? Are education activities occurring? And are education activities effective? So this is another element that's going to be part of our round robin discussion at the top of the next hour. So Dusty, speaking of education, Beaker really got a good education the other day.
Oh yeah?
So, yeah. When he found out he was lactose intolerant, he didn't really first accept those results. He asked his doctor for a second opinion. So the doctor agreed, opened his office door, and his cat came wandering in. The doctor showed him the results. The cat nodded its head and then walked out. Beaker, in his Beaker voice, said, he still wanted a third opinion. So the doctor opened the door. The doctor's Labrador retriever came in, looked at the results, nodded his head in agreement, and left. So after that, Beaker decided, okay, I guess I am lactose intolerant. The doctor handed him the bill. And oh my gosh, Dusty, do you realize his bill was over $3,000?
Oh my.
Yes. So the doctor charged him $50 for the office visits, and then $1,500 for the CAT scan, and another $1,500 for the lab tests.
Thanks, Eric.
All
right.
Dusty.
Now for the administration element. Oh wait, this one's yours, Eric.
Oh, you're doing so well. Go ahead.
And lastly, the wilderness character baseline element. This element, which has brought you all here, I'm sure. I'm not going to say much more about wilderness character monitoring itself, and I know you have others that will talk about this element later. But let's see here. I just want you to know that this element requires a unit to conduct wilderness character monitoring work and get that baseline and that narrative going. If you're interested in more about wilderness character monitoring, at the top of the hour, there's going to be a wilderness character monitoring overview. All right, as mentioned before, there are 2 additional reporting checkboxes also added. There's the boundary maps that must be completed and transmitted to Congress, and the annual upward reporting must be completed on time. All right, Jacob, could you throw up the last pop or another pop quiz? Other than the required elements, which element do you think is the most selected? And while folks are filling out, I know that we went through a lot of elements, right? There were more than, there were 20 elements, right, that we went through. Remember, wilderness areas only have to select 10. 3 of those are required, so they're really only looking at 7. Okay, it looks like polling has slowed down. So if you want to go ahead and end polling, Jacob. It looks like folks voted on opportunities for solitude with invasive species and recreation sites coming in close after that. Well, if you guessed opportunities for solitude, then you are correct. Go ahead, Eric.
And the good news is actually the order of results is pretty much the order of popularity as well. Recreation sites is very high up there. Invasive species is really high. So as Dusty shows on your screen right now, this is the breakdown of elements for all 448 Forest Service wilderness areas. Dark green is what the wilderness is measured on. The light green are bonus elements that were selected for the local unit to track, but they are not required to report on that information as part of the end of the year reporting with this performance measure.
Collectively, these qualities and elements comprise what we are calling the Wilderness Stewardship Performance Table of Elements.
So now we're going to go to the resources. There's a lot of resources available to you. And when it comes to the primary resource, the best bet is the Wilderness Stewardship Performance Guidebook. This guidebook, it's updated annually. It was just reposted in April, actually. And the latest date of the version is on the front cover. The scoring within the elements has stayed relatively the same over the years since 2015, but information is added annually, clarifying scoring based on lessons learned, clarifying deliverables, as well as the documentation. This guidebook is also available on Wilderness Connect, so our partners who assist us with many of these elements can also have access to it. So I'm going to walk you through some of the information that you can find specifically in this guidebook. And so let's take a quick look at, again, the invasive species element. That one comes up awfully a lot. So within the guidebook, it provides a description of the element as you see here. It identifies the key terms, the definitions, what the overall outcome associated with this element is going to be. It also identifies the scoring deliverables at each of the 5 components within this element, as well as the deliverables associated with them. Explanatory notes, links to supporting resources and other information are also found within the guidebook. And lastly, the frequently asked questions. These are really the lessons learned that we pick up during the year. If somebody asks us a question, it means it's not explained well. So we add that within the guidebook to help people at specific point levels, what does count, what does not count. And those are also found within each of the elements within the guidebook.
Within the Forest Service on our internal networks, we have a National Wilderness Stewardship Performance SharePoint site as well, which contains a section for protocols, tools, and templates. Unfortunately, this is only accessible within the Forest Service network at this time. It's not a public-facing website, but partners, you can work with your local agency contacts to get access to many of the resources that we're going to share here on the SharePoint.
So within that SharePoint site, there are protocols and tools and templates for each of the elements. So just as this shows, the SharePoint site includes a folder for each element, and we have completed recorded trainings, such as I mentioned, we're doing the Water and Agency Management Actions webinar on June 9th. All those past trainings that we have are included within each of these folders. But besides that, there's also a whole bunch of just other deliverables and examples that may be found within the SharePoint site. So besides the SharePoint site, these webinars can also be found on Wilderness Connect, and we are going to start working on seeing how we can get more of the files and folders files within these folders on the Wilderness Connect as well. But this is an example of just some of those resources that are in there. So again, this is invasive species. It opens it up. And again, as we had mentioned, there's 5 deliverables. Each deliverable has a point value, and the file name actually starts with what that point value or that sample addresses within the elements.
Thanks, Eric. And we'll make sure the latest version of the Wilderness Stewardship Performance Guidebook also gets posted to Wilderness Connect as well. So besides these great tools and resources, we've also been developing new tools to communicate and facilitate an understanding of wilderness stewardship performance. One of my favorite quotes is, "Science is not finished until it's communicated," by the UK Chief Scientist, Sir Mark Walport. Our work as wilderness stewards is not complete until it's been communicated, and I'll go further and add understood. We have developed some basic end-of-year reports at the national and regional level since 2015. However, we are using emerging technology and the fact that a few of us are a little nerdy to improve these reports to show a lot more data to help managers and regional program managers develop strategies on better ways to accomplish and communicate work, especially to our and with our partners and decision makers. So this new report formats provides element details and distribution of management actions. In this case, we're looking at the invasive species element at the national level and how many wilderness areas in each region selected this element and how scores are doing on those pie charts by region. And we can look at the regional reports to get wilderness specific data. Again, the invasive species element and scoring distribution of wilderness areas in the southwestern region is displayed here. Think of the reports as the guidebook, but with the data reported by each unit at the end of the fiscal year. The reports are available on the Wilderness Stewardship Performance SharePoint site and are organized by Forest Service region, as well as by individual elements. Please take a look at them and feel free to pull out the 1 or 2 pages that you need to communicate wilderness stewardship performance to your local supervisor and partners. Finally, we are developing interactive dashboards as a user-friendly way to explore our data for each wilderness. More about this to come later.
Well, this completes our review of the elements found in Wilderness Stewardship Performance. We hope you enjoyed your time with us here at the National Wilderness Skills Institute Laboratory. We are now going to open it up for any questions that you may want to add to the chat box. And like I said, you're more than welcome to raise your hand, and we'll do our best to find you to ask some questions. So, one of the things while you're thinking of some questions that, we've heard either throughout this week or just in general over the last now 6 years since Wilderness Stewardship Performance came out is the difficulty. How hard is it? And complex and extensive it really is. So there's a couple things. Really, for several of these elements, they're just building off of the previous performance measure. And so you're already, in many cases, started to address some of the work. The other thing is there's a lot of local interpretation that is allowed. Actually, when Wilderness Stewardship Performance came out in 2015, a lot of the FAQs, frequently asked questions, said this is a local determination. How to address this is important to you. This is what you need to do at your local level to identify those sideboards and address your needs. And people actually came back to us and said, we don't like to have this much freedom, give us more direction. And we've really still tried to stay pretty out of that. We don't want to make this too complicated. And I've said this in several of the sessions during the week. There's no Wilderness Stewardship Performance police that's going to chase you down and say, show me the plan that you're using, show me the direction that you're following. A lot of Wilderness Stewardship Performance is, in a sense, about passing the red face test on what's best for your wilderness area. Like we said early on, there's no cheating in Wilderness Stewardship Performance. Right now, we are looking at the points, but we're looking at the points as more than anything is how to help you. How to get tools and templates out to assist you with doing better at Wilderness Stewardship Performance. And again, many of these things are tasks that are from other program areas that you're already doing. Trail management objectives, for example, are required for all trails. So just because it's part of Wilderness Stewardship Performance doesn't mean it's a terrible task or something additional related to wilderness. It's part of what you're supposed to be doing with the Trails program. Same thing with many of these areas with forest plan direction and taking action when you're outside of forest plan direction. So don't overthink this. And that's our ultimate goal with Wilderness Stewardship Performance. It's to help guide you with your basic management of wilderness and not to have a gotcha moment. If you think you're getting into a gotcha moment and someone's doing that to you, you're overthinking wilderness stewardship performance. It's an assistance tool and a way to track management over time.
And build partnerships with your other programs at your local, forest, region, and even national level.
Yeah, Kim, so you can change elements. So the question in the chat is, can you change elements? So we discourage it just because, if you're already 6 years in, you've been working on an element, do you really want to toss it away and start over with a new element? Probably not, but there's a couple things. One, we're finding that several years into it, as we have done some data quality checks, is that, as you know, people are changing jobs. Somebody new comes into a position, they look at the elements that were selected, they get to know the area, they may disagree. Same thing, we've seen that with a lot of line officers. Earlier on, we talked about don't go after the elements that give you a high score, go after the elements that address issues. We're finding that some of the line officers maybe picked elements in 2015 that gave them that high score. New line officers are coming into the job, identifying that and going, now let's change elements. Let's go after something that will actually address an issue. So that there are opportunities to change elements. The other thing is there are some elements that honestly will time out. Non-compliant infrastructure. Over time, addressing that element, you're going to be ridding yourself of all your non-compliant infrastructure. So you have to be able to move on from that element someday. So yes, you can change elements, work with your local line officer who will then coordinate with the regional program managers who then works with me to make those changes. We just ask that you have a decent justification. And again, we're not going to drill you on that. You know your area and what's important to your area.
And hey, Pete, I see your questions about any plans to move away from SharePoint with internal access only. That's a USDA decision, but what they have recently allowed is for our partners to be able to be granted USDA access to our SharePoint and internal sites. So you just need to work with your local unit, or if they're not sure where those resources are to get that account set up, you can also email me and I can help provide those resources for how to get access to our internal SharePoint sites.
Yeah, so Pete, that was a big change. Pinion, early on started off as if you went through the external collaboration process, you get access to Pinion. SharePoint is now the same way. That just happened in the last month or so, that we can work with people to grant them access to SharePoint.
Hey, Eric, I feel like 8 and 9 today because I was paired up with you.
Oh, thanks,
Get
Dusty.
it? In RNA, 8 and 9A forms a base pair with uracil, you.